and let's get down to looking at the historical context that's relevant for individual verses and books of the Bible. We're going to start by looking at the people and the time that a book was written and understanding that historical context and how it affects meaning. To do that, though, let me give kind of a general introduction to the 7 different areas of historical context that we'll learn to analyze. So the introductory comments here, with the blanks, I know that you're wondering, what are they? Some of you are writing them in. You're guessing. You're excited. Here's the answers. The books in the Bible were written by specific authors to specific audiences at specific times. None of that's revolutionary. It's just helpful to know how to use that information for interpreting individual books. And that's what we're going to do here in this next session. But let me introduce the rest of what we'll do in the next session. Their world is different than our world. Obvious. They had different surroundings, different politics, a different culture, and a different history. So again, the reason I break these out in categories is so that you can kind of train your mind to be asking questions or to be aware of references to these things in any text that you're reading, the surroundings, the politics, the culture, or the different history. Well, if our goal is to understand the author's intended meaning, then we must learn about their world and how much different it is from ours. We know this is the case. I mean, right? There are certain countries around the world where you're supposed to drive on the left, and certain countries around the world you're supposed to drive on the right. If you confuse that matter as you travel internationally, you have a problem. Unless you're in India, where you can drive on both sides of the road, it doesn't matter. It's a free-for-all. I just came back from there. It's a thrilling experience to drive anywhere. Actually drove for like 7 miles backwards on the wrong side of interstate. It didn't matter. It was just, well, this is the only place we could get on, so everyone else will move over. That's not the best approach to take of, let me just read the Bible and make a bunch of cultural mistakes along the way, i.e. misinterpret verse after verse after verse. It's not the approach we want to take. Thankfully, I mean, God is gracious. I mean, there are so many lives that have been changed even with partial or wrong, understandings of different Bible verses. God's amazing like that. But it doesn't mean we want to try and be even more wrong so that the grace of God might show up in more abundance. Paul deals with that argument in Romans and says that's not the way to go with it. So here's the 7 areas you see of historical analysis in the box, brief description of them. You can read that. Let's get to work on each one of these steps with the examples that are there in the workbook. So we'll start with going back to Philippians. I won't harp on chapter 4, verse 13 too much more. But the first question to answer about Philippians is about the author's situation. It's priceless, to know where the author is coming from. Right? This is fundamental to preventing miscommunication. It's also helpful in, it's not just going to prevent miscommunication, but it's going to deepen what is communicated by understanding where the author's coming from. So I've asked you to look up Philippians 1, 12 to 14. Can someone tell me, where is Paul when he writes this letter? Prison, which is a very common experience for Paul. He did not always have a way with the authorities that worked out in his favor. And of course, okay, so he's in prison, right? Sometimes you hear that and you go, random historical fact, great. I'm here for God to speak to me through the Bible, though. I don't know, thanks for the random historical fact. Well, the reason why it's important is because it provides depth and perspective for the things he says in the book, right? Many people describe the book of Philippians as a book of joy. Because the word joy and rejoice, the verb, is found more times, per word in the book of Philippians than any other book, right? So we do a mathematical analysis and we go, it's about joy. Well, that's a theme. That's a theme. When you read, it's important to ask the question, what gives Paul joy? What gives Paul joy? So, figure that out. I've given you some verses where the words joy or rejoice occur. Philippians 1:4, 1:18, 2:2, 2:17, 3:1, 4:1. Read around and let me know what brings him this joy. Prayer? Right. The advancement of the gospel. He's pretty pumped about that.
He also seems really happy about the unity within the church.
And when you read the whole of the book, there's a reason why he wants unity. And it isn't for unity's sake, right? It's verse 27 in Philippians chapter 1. Conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or remain absent, I'll hear that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind. So yes, he wants unity. Why? Striving together for the faith of the gospel. He wants people to get along because that is part and parcel of advancing the gospel, right? In this church, he'll go on to say in chapter 4 about it, it's like this lady has her group and this lady has her group and they just fight with each other all the time. And he's like, that is not helping us get the gospel out. Internal fighting as opposed to a united effort to advance the gospel, that's not going to work. So that's why he loves unity. Again, it's related to this bigger purpose that brings him joy. So, I asked this question: what new depth to Paul's expressed joy and contentment is discovered by considering the author's situation? Not too complicated. He's in prison. His life stinks. But Paul's joy isn't rooted in his situation. His joy is rooted in the advancement of the gospel. And so here's a guy who should have every reason to complain, to just be struggling, bummed. But, he rejoices over the advance of the gospel. And when we know that his situation was that bad, languishing away in a prison, and yet he still has all this joy, it's a pretty powerful image of a person with all the right values. Right? Because, we'll lose our joy with much smaller problems in front of us. And yet, Paul in prison and in a Roman context, that brings great shame, great isolation. The shame with being put in prison back in Roman days would cause you to lose friends. People wouldn't visit you. They'd dissociate you because it could hurt their social status. Not too different from today in certain ways. So Paul was losing friends, and he talks about that in other letters. It was tough times. But it didn't matter. That wasn't the determining factor to whether or not he was rejoicing. But here's the question, on our front to ask, right? The way you bring something like that home is ask yourself, think of the last time you were full of joy, deeply satisfied. Why? What happened? What caused that? I think it's very important every now and again to stop and ask yourself, what is the cause of the last time I was full of joy and the cause of the last time I was full of sadness? It's a wake-up call if in both of those it was, I got something for myself and then I lost something for myself. And that's what determined my last big smile and my last tears. Right? So this is, part of how we can gauge where our values are at. Paul's joy was kind of a thermometer that showed us into his heart where his values were, and advancing the gospel is the ultimate thing. And that's what thrills him or disappoints him. What is it that brings us joy or disappoints us? So this is the way that the message of Scripture gets deeper. That a few verses about joy get more personal because you understand the person behind the text. We won't spend too much time on Psalm 51, but someone look it up, or if you already know, when was Psalm 51 written? Yeah, right after David committed adultery. Right, so we read Psalm 51, and look at David asking to be washed white as snow. Again, keeping that verse in the context of what happened is really, really important. I mean, which of the 10 commands had David just broken? Anyone know? A whole bunch. He was racking them up. Right? I mean, you think about it. Right? Yeah, there's clearly, don't commit adultery. Okay, check, he did that one. Found Bathsheba, said, I don't care if you're married. I'm gonna bring you into my house. What's that? Coveting, right? So number 10, whoops, did that one too. That's how it all started, because instead of going out to war during the summer when kings are supposed to lead their armies, he stayed back home, sat on his roof, and looked for trouble to get into. Not a good idea. Murder. Well, thou shalt not murder. Okay, whoops, got that one. All right. What else? Yeah. Don't lie. No, I can. I'll try and get away with the fact that I killed Uriah. So what? I killed her husband to cover it up, and that didn't quite work. Okay, when you just recall kind of the things that had just happened, this cycle of sin and then sin to make up for the sin you just did, and sin to cover up for the sin that you used to try and make up for the previous sin, this big horrible sequence in David's life, that's what gives context and should help you really feel and experience the weight of someone here saying, be gracious, O God. Wash me thoroughly, cleanse me from my sins. I know my transgressions, my sin is ever before me. Yeah, it's weighing on him. He feels it. He knows it. Right? And so as you go through that and see him, saying in verse 8, make me to hear joy and gladness, let the bones that you've broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, blot out my iniquities, create in me a clean heart. I mean, this is a big deal that he was involved in, and so the heart and the reality of it all becomes much clearer when you can stick it right there in the actual flow of David's life. So understanding the author's situation can be quite helpful. So let's jump to number 2 there, the audience's situation. we're going to think about the book of Hebrews. Particularly, let's turn to chapter 10, verses 32 to 39. Interesting warning here that the writer of Hebrews gives his first audience. Tells them, do not shrink back. So, as you read through there, the author says, remember the former days, after being enlightened, you endured a great conflict of suffering, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. You showed sympathy to prisoners, accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and a lasting one. Therefore, don't throw away your confidence. Verse 36, you have need of endurance. Verse 39, we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but those who have faith to the persevering of the soul. So, I want you to use the purpose statement of Hebrews, if you're not already there, in the back of your packet to answer that question. What might the readers be tempted to turn back to? The author of Hebrews is saying, don't go back to that. Write down your answer when you get it. Once you see that purpose statement and have a general sense of what's going on with the audience, it's an easy question. Right? He doesn't want them to go back to the temple and start submitting sacrifices again, thereby saying what Jesus did wasn't enough. We need to keep on doing the old thing at the temple. Right? But these Jewish Christians were taking it on the chin by, family members and friends. How could you not go back to the temple and obey the law and fulfill your responsibilities to worship there? They were being excluded from basically the society in which they lived. And so, the other Jews wouldn't do business with them because they were becoming apostate Jews since they thought Jesus was the once-for-all sacrifice. And so the author of Hebrews is pleading with them. Okay, you've endured so much persecution. Don't stop now. Don't stop now. Don't go back there. Don't do that. You don't need priests and sacrifices to atone for sin. You know that. You know that. So understanding what the temptation is that the author is getting at is unbelievably important, so that you just don't start thinking, well, I think shrinking back, means, to drink root beer, and you just shouldn't go drink root beer, we want to understand the dynamics of what's going on and look for then, that helps us understand if there are parallels in our own life, in our own culture. Well, let's jump forward here to 2 Peter. There's a book that is not too often studied or cited in my experience. seen a lot more done with 1 Peter. 2 Peter, I think it's not studied because the content of 2 Peter is a little weird because of the audience and what they were struggling with. So use the purpose of each Bible book chart again to figure out what kind of teaching the first readers of 2 Peter were dealing with. Right, what were the kind of three main bad ideas being promoted that Peter is thinking need to be corrected? God's not in control. Yeah, there's no judgment, there's no afterlife. If you want a big word for that, the reason why this teaching became popular, it actually kind of grew out of teaching from a guy named Epicurus, Greek philosopher. You've probably been familiar with Epicurean thought, or at least someone tried to teach it to you somewhere along the way, and you tried to not remember such a strange word, but this is, we've found documentation of people promoting this view of what we would consider to be an Epicurean anti-theodicy. That right there, that's just free. An anti-theodicy. What is that? Right? I mean, these were, there's this theodicy of like how does God deal with the evil in the world? Well, an anti-theodicy is he doesn't. He's not involved. He doesn't judge. And there will be nothing dealt with in the end. And so this was circulating. Of course, what's the moral conclusion of that theology?
Do whatever you want.
Do whatever you want. Absolutely. Total hedonism, just unchecked immorality. And that's what you see being described if you read 2 Peter, particularly as you get in to the heart of chapter 2. That's just the consequence. And so Peter had to demonstrate, no. Don't say God's not involved. God is involved. And what are the two acts of God that he uses to prove his argument?
Creation and the flood.
Right. He got the whole thing going. It's kind of involved there at creation. And in fact, when things got out of line early, he stepped in with the flood. So don't tell me that God doesn't get involved in judgment. Right? Again, that's, I've still got this picture up here of the whole storyline of the Bible. Remember I said there's New Testament authors and that have this whole storyline as their framework for reality. Peter's no different. And so for someone to come and say, well, God's not involved, he doesn't intervene to do things like judge, he just says, well, that's just baloney. Let's start talking about the facts. And so he starts with creation. Look, boom, God's involved. The flood, boom, God's involved. Need I say more? Of course, he doesn't stop there. That's why my third question about 2 Peter is, who's been punished by God in the past, according to 2 Peter 2, 4 through 10? Okay, angels. All those evil people during Noah's time, and who else? Sodom and Gomorrah. Right, so again, he's just picking out parts of the story of what God has done in history, the same story we can read about in the Old Testament, and saying, well, your argument that God doesn't get involved to punish, the evidence goes against you on that one. Right, so again, why does he remind his audience of this fact? It's so that they'll know, no, you will be held accountable if history has anything to say in the matter. So, but when we read 2 Peter, if we don't know what's going on with the audience, it just seems kind of like, why are we talking about Sodom and Gomorrah all of a sudden? Why are you bringing up the flood? Some of this stuff will hit us kind of like it's out of the blue, and we won't know what to do with it unless we have a bit of an understanding of what is going on. Okay, and so knowing some of the issues the audience was dealing with helps us understand what the author selected to put into the book. And then we can get a lot faster towards the lessons that are to be learned as opposed to, where did that come from? The time period. It's one of those things when early on, if you begin to go, yeah, I want to know some of the background information, and you look up in a commentary or a dictionary some information about a book, and early on, they'll give you kind of like estimated dates. You know, somewhere, well, we think this was a prophet maybe in the 6th century BC, or no, this book was written in 55 AD. And there's kind of the so what question that comes up. Again, what does that date matter to me? I mean, if it was written in 50 AD or 150 AD, that doesn't help me at all. Right? So just knowing dates of when books were probably written doesn't get you very far unless you know how to make sense of their significance. So that's what I want to do here. It's just so you can have an Old Testament example, New Testament example of how knowing the time period helps you understand, okay, well, if that was written or said or occurred here, well, what events happened after or before it that helps me understand something about how God works, who God is, or how God is faithful. So Deuteronomy 28, which I describe as a promise that the prophets preached. So there are a lot of deadly consequences that are announced if Israel disobeys in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Simple question just to get squared up is, okay, who is the person who first announced all of these deadly consequences for disobedience in Deuteronomy 28? And the answer is Moses, right? You can go back to chapter 27, verse 11 to confirm if you don't believe me. So that's just quick setting the stage. Now, as you read through Deuteronomy 28, what is the ultimate consequence for Israel if they keep disobeying God? According to verses 63 and 64. I heard exile down here. Curse. There's destruction. A scattering, exile. Yeah. It'll come about that as the Lord delighted over you to prosper you and multiply you, so the Lord will delight over you to make you perish and destroy you, and you'll be torn from the land where you're entering to possess it. Exile. Moreover, the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth, and there you'll serve other gods, wood and stone, which you or your fathers have not known. Yikes. But this is part of what Moses delivered to the people long, long ago. So now the answer to that third bullet point is fairly obvious. right? If this promise of destruction and exile in Deuteronomy was given before any prophet ever warned Israel that God would send foreign armies to destroy and scatter her, well, where'd they get that idea? Not too hard to figure out. But why do I bring this up? Bring it up because all these predictions, okay? You can go back earlier in Deuteronomy 28, things like locust plagues and low agriculture production, famines, and ultimately exile and destruction. All of this stuff was laid out clearly from day one. If you want to persist in disobedience, this is where you'll end up. This is the discipline that will come. Most of what the prophets did was not say, oh, wait a minute, I have a totally fresh message from God that you've never heard, and it is, you're going to go to exile if you disobey him. No, they took the revealed will of God and applied it to Israel's situation. Right? Quite similar to what preachers do today. You're going to go into exile if you don't repent. Yeah, the law said that. Prophets brought it into specific contexts and mentioned specific players. It will be Babylon. It will be... So that's just to help you understand a little bit of, okay, when I know that these threats were first delivered way back during Moses' day, when later on in the story up here, when you get to times when Jeremiah is saying exile is coming, when Isaiah is saying exile is coming, not a big surprise. When Joel is saying, yeah, that locust plague was actually the judgment of God. Well, yeah, that's what Deuteronomy 28 said. So Joel talking about the locust plague is understanding the law and simply reminding people of how to interpret what's going on in history using God's word.